Today's lesson is Lesson 2, Taxation Without Representation. The mighty British Empire found itself in a tricky situation at the close of the French and Indian War. Because of their victory, they took over a huge piece of land from France, from west of the 13 colonies all the way to the Mississippi River, as well as the remainder of the eastern Canada. New territory brought with it new power, but more responsibility and some headaches as well. There were two major issues that faced the British as a result of their newly won territory, and they both had to do with paying the bills. Number one, have you ever heard the phrase, "You've got to spend money to make money"? England had spent lots of money, and now they needed to make some. They had borrowed huge amounts of money to pay for the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War in Europe, and they needed a new source of income to repay their debts. Number two, now that all this land was under British control, they needed to defend it. European settlers were heading west and establishing homesteads, and indigenous people felt their way of life was being disrupted. This land had, after all, been their home long before the Europeans had arrived. Conflicts arose regularly between the indigenous peoples and European settlers. Homesteads and British forts were attacked and retaliation ensued. This scared the English. To maintain control, they sent 10,000 soldiers to North America. And as you might imagine, this was no small expense. England needed an immediate source of income to protect its newly acquired territory. England's many bills were coming due. British Prime Minister George Grenville had a plan to regain some much-needed money. He figured that because much of this debt was incurred in the defense of the colonies, they should be the ones to pay for it. In his words, the nation has run itself into immense debt to give them protection, and now they are called upon to contribute a small share toward the public expense. As you will see, this attitude violated the trust many colonists had in the British government and did irreparable damage to the relationship with Mother England. Taxation without representation. Grenville's idea was to tax the colonies, but many colonists didn't exactly see eye to eye with him. They felt it was unfair that the government had all the say in what taxes they would pay, while colonies had no representatives in the British Parliament, the part of the government that makes the laws. This came to be known as the taxation without representation, and it was a major issue in the events that led up to the Revolutionary War. George Grenville did not last long as Prime Minister, only 2 years. Take a look at what went wrong can teach us something about the qualities of a strong leader. He was known as a stubborn and intolerant man. He ignored English leaders in the colony when they warned him against the Stamp Act, harshly criticized those who disagreed with his plan to tax the colonists, and made many enemies. Proverbs 16:7 tells us, when a man's ways pleases the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. This reminds us of how important it is to show respect as leaders, even when we disagree. Don't think you're a leader? Think again. You can lead your family and friends by your example every day. You have the opportunity to show them the heart of God by showing grace and love in all circumstances. For an activity break, you could look up a picture or painting of George Grenville. What did he look like? If you'd like, everyone can try their hand at sketching or painting a picture of him. While you do, discuss what it takes to be a good leader. You may or may not agree with Grenville's proposal to tax the colonists to pay for British debt, but it wasn't just about money. Some colonists were starting to feel mistreated and ignored by their government, and this made them less willing to accept the new taxes. Let's take a look at some of the laws that were imposed on the colonies, and you can decide for yourself whether or not they were as unfair as these colonists believed them to be. The Molasses Act, 1733. To understand the events that occurred in the 1760s, we need the backstory. Let's go back 30 years to when the British government passed the Molasses Act. Did you know that North America was not the only place in Europe countries were claiming land and creating colonies? The same thing was happening in the West Indies, a group of islands in the Caribbean Sea. Molasses and white sugar were imported from the West Indies, where sugarcane was grown. Molasses was important to the economy of the colonies because it was needed to distill rum, which was a major export. England, of course, preferred that American colonies buy molasses from the islands they controlled, as opposed to those that belonged to other imperialistic powers, such as the French or the Dutch. By imposing a 6-cent per gallon tax on foreign molasses, they pretty much guaranteed that the colonies would only buy it from the English. This was not a bad plan. The problem was that the law wasn't enforced. For the most part, it was ignored, and molasses was usually just smuggled into the colonies. Let's resume our place in 1763 and get back to George Grenville and his taxes. The Sugar Act, 1764. George Grenville recycled the molasses tax in 1764 by passing the Sugar Act. It was basically the same law, but the British government would no longer let the colonists get away with ignoring it. Grenville even decreased the tax on molasses from 6 cents to 3 cents per gallon in hopes of less resistance from the colonies. He taxed white or refined sugar as well. But the catch was this: he also appointed agents to enforce the law. They went on board ships entering the harbor, checking for molasses and sugar that were being smuggled in, and penalizing those who were ignoring the tax. This enforcement cost the merchants money, but also gave them the impression that Britain was just flexing its muscles, showing off its authority and strength. As we will see again and again, many in the 13 colonies felt they were losing control and fiercely clung to their freedoms. They complained that the British government was taking advantage of them by interfering in their business transactions without giving them a voice in the decision-making. The Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act was the next attempt made by the British government, proposed once again by George Grenville to collect revenue from the colonies. A tax was announced on all printed goods, legal documents like wills and property deeds, newspapers, diplomas, playing cards, and even dice. The name came from the official stamp showing the tax amount that was placed on these items when they were sold. This tax differed from prior ones in that it was an internal tax, meaning it was a charge on something within the colonies, not on an import. You might wonder why this made a difference. The big issue for the colonists was that internal taxes had always been decided upon by their own colonial government. This was a major shift. You can imagine that the freedom-loving colonists were none too pleased with another source of taxation without representation. While the Sugar Act brought about some grumbling and even formal complaints from colonial assemblies to Parliament, it was nothing compared to the reaction to the Stamp Act. Let's look at these 3 ways the colonists greeted the news of the new tax. Number 1, declaring their rights. The governments of several colonies made official declarations of their rights to Parliament. They had been deciding internal taxes on their own through their local government for years and didn't want to accept the interference. 2, boycotts. Colonists didn't wait around for their local government to handle the situation. A boycott of goods from Britain was organized by shopkeepers throughout the colony. They were serious about letting them know that they wouldn't stand for what was happening. Some even went so far as to post signs letting colonists know if a shop wasn't participating in the boycott in order to discourage people from supporting it. 3, violence and force. Property was destroyed. Employees of the British government were tormented, and mobs thronged seaports and refused to allow English ships bearing the paper stamps to dock. Disorder and violence escalated, and regrettably, relations between England and her 13 colonies only got worse from there. making it personal. In Boston, one of the largest cities in the colonies, a man named Andrew Oliver had been appointed to collect the tax. An angry mob hung an effigy of Oliver in the downtown tree with a note pinned to it that said, "What greater joy did New England see than a stamp man hanging on a tree?" The crowd later carried the figure to his house and burned it, while breaking windows and vandalizing his house. Oliver got the message and resigned the next day. Scenes similar to this began to happen throughout the colonies, and most agents followed Oliver's example and quit their post. Many colonists were convinced that the Stamp Act was just a small step in England's plot to strip them of their freedom. Because of the bitter determination of the colonists, financial pressure in the form of boycotts, and their extreme reaction to the passing of the Stamp Act, Parliament repealed the tax in 1766. The colonists had made their voices heard. Parliament still felt compelled, however, to let the colonists know who was in charge. They enacted the Declarationary Act at the same time. It basically said that the British government had complete power to make any laws they liked in governing the 13 colonies. They weren't giving up that easily. The bottom line is this: there are two sides to every story, and neither the colonists nor the British wanted to compromise. Have you ever felt like that? The British government needed money and felt totally justified in expecting the colonists to help pay for their debts, while the colonies adamantly refused to accept being taxed without having a say in the process. Did they both have a point? Of course. Only time would tell how world-changing the issue of taxation without representation would end. Let's talk about it. Do you think that colonies were responsible for contributing to Britain's debts following the French and Indian War? Why do you think that colonists were so strongly opposed? Was the violence that followed the Stamp Act justified? What do you think you would have done? And this concludes our lesson 2 for today, all right?